okay? All right. Welcome, lovely people. Because I am in a different room and a different time than earlier, we may have people filtering in as we go. But if you're here for Alaskan plants or traditional healing, then you're in the right place. So, tle ka klenach Meda DeWitt yuchat duasak linget klenach zetzinach yuchat duasak nanyaina chatzati kachadi yadi chatzati shtakin kwanachat. My English name is Meda DeWitt. My Tlingit names are Tsetzinak and Katdu Klaat, and I have adopted a Nupak name, Tigigalook, and an adopted Northern Cree name, Boss Eagle Spirit Woman, and somehow that just turns into Bossy. I have no idea how that happened. But I am a child of the Kachadi of Wrangell, and I am Nanyai. I'm also the grandchild of the Tiatan and the Tluknahadi. I have some pictures up here. So this is Jenny Billy, and her name was Daskawa. And then there's Marion DeWitt. Some of you may have known Marion. That's my grandmother. So her Kachadi name was actually Shawat Klein. And but when she was little, the family would call her Daskawa. And her uncle Richard would sing to her, Daskawa, Daskawa, come back to me. Daskawa, Daskawa, come back to me. And it's interesting because Daskawa is actually a Nanyai name. And what her uncle had told her when she was real little is that at some point she would have a Nanyai grandchild or great-grandchild, female, and that would be Daskawa coming back. So when I was pregnant with this feisty little one, Linda DeWitt and my grandma agreed that she would be Daskawa. So that's her English name and her Tlingit name, and also Christy Jameson has Daskawa as well, shared name. But she was born with bright red hair, and nobody else in the family has bright red hair. And so traditionally, in our culture, if somebody was born with bright red hair, that would be a sign that they were going to work with medicine later on. And I say this because the work that I do is not, I mean, it is for myself to a degree because I have a desire, a hunger for culture and family and community and clan. But what my elders told me is all the work that I do, as hard as it may be at times, is so that she can just be herself and not be encumbered with the same thing. So she can actually surpass anything that I could ever personally get to. So that's why we do the work. So just a little explanation. I have a hybrid talk. I'm going to be talking about traditional healing and about plants. And part of that is because I actually had two presentations originally, and we had guests coming in, so I put away one spot. And on the agenda, it has a title of plants, but it has a description of traditional healing. And I had to kind of giggle. I'm like, well, I wonder what people are going to be there for. So I did some of both. I'm going to be cruising through a lot of these slides. I'm not going to read them verbatim to you. And later on, if you want to read them, you can go through the presentation and just pause and read through them if you'd like. And so I'm going to talk largely about the traditional healing work and how it applies to where we are at now. And then I'm going to go through some plant pictures that we took up the river today at the Stikine. So I do apologize for not being at the earlier talk and rescheduling for now. I had the opportunity to go up to the Stikine River, up to the glacier today, and it was my first time actually going up to the glacier. And I'm a great-great-grandchild of Chief Shakes VII. And so that's our traditional homelands, clan-wise and family-wise. So my auntie's really like, yeah, good choice. So Ganesh Chish for being here. You've seen pictures of these people quite a bit this week. So I have been blessed to have actually both of them in my family. One side is with Tilly Paul Tamarie, and the other side is Chief Shakes. And so their children, Louis Paul and Tilly Jones, were married. And so that's the lineage that I come from here. That's just about PhD work that I'm trying to struggle through and procrastinate. I do have a master's in traditional healing program development, and I did my bachelor's on women's rites of passage, our Southeast puberty rights, and human services degrees and all sorts of stuff. So the most important education, though, is the cultural education. And when getting into this work, I quickly found out that I had to have a way of blending Western and traditional. And at the time when I started going to school back in 2005, we did not have this decolonization structures that we've been working on for this last 10 years. People were talking about it, they knew they need to have it, but there wasn't really a blended way of doing that work. So really going through an internal and external process, spending time with our elders, right, our living libraries and culture bearers, doing as much research as possible, and also meditation and prayer is indigenous way of knowing and learning information. And of course, talking with peers and mentors, and then testing the ideas. And then actively engaging with the topic. So when I talk about plant medicine, I make plant medicine. When I talk about body work, I actually do body work, energy work, ceremony. So these aren't things, not that academia is a bad thing, but for the work that I'm doing, there are things that you actually have to immerse yourself in to understand. So there's different methods. I'm not going to go through all of these. It just talks, about the different applied aspects. One of the things that helped quite a bit was feminist research, because we're matrilineal, and there's concepts in there that help to put a lens on the patriarchal writing from the explorers and different groups that have come in. So origin of doctrine and discovery. So in the 1400s, we had Pope Nicholas V, who wrote a papal bull that basically granted through the documents apostolic authority, full and free permission to invade, search out, capture, and subjugate the pagans and unbelievers, right, and enemies of Christ. So within these doctrines of discovery, what happened is they exist and they built on each other even through Indian law. And we get to this point where it creates others. It creates otherness. And that's really that first step of being disconnected from land and from each other, is that creation of otherness. And they did that intentionally for this buildup of wealth and power. And so Wilson Justin, he talks about climate change as starting with contact. So it didn't start 40 years ago. It started at contact, because that's when our relationship with the environment actually went out of balance. And so here's a document in 2018 that was released under Bill Walker and Val Davidson and Joe Butler, who is our chief medical officer. And it talked about the health impacts of climate change and how they're going to affect us emotionally and behaviorally and physically, our nutrition, everything. And it had a lot of truth in there. And then with the next administration, that document actually disappeared off the web. Thankfully, I had downloaded it, so it's available. But it talks about how nearly 90% of Alaska Native communities are located on the coast. And they predict that, or determine that 183 or 86% of these communities are at risk of flooding and erosion. And that's 86% of our communities in the whole state. And so the threat and process of community relocation is very stressful for people. and it will result in a variety of health outcomes and psychosocial distress, right? And so this just talks about, colonization. To colonize a person or a place, the person themselves had to experience some level of trauma. So going into deep introspection and looking at this history, and getting back to Rome and how they had, these cities with the walls around them, and they had all of the family and society and art and culture, everything all bottled up into this space. And it was, again, that concept of otherness, right, and separation from. And so colonization and assimilation is a process of disassociation from natural human being or being a real human being. And what I realized is because most humans actually aren't born that way. We're not generally born sociopathic. We're born in a way that we're communal, right? We're social. We want to have, that interaction right from birth. And so what I realized is they had weaponized the soldiers' love for their family and community to go out and to colonize and advance the bringing home of more resources and more power, in fear that there might not be enough or that there will be other encroaching groups. So colonization in itself is a process of systemic trauma applied in an intentional manner that becomes a norm and a cultural standard. So there's many processes that we have now that are actually systemic trauma in the way that they're applied. And I had to put this in here because I had a challenge reconciling Christianity, and I'm sure I'm not the only one here hearing about the boarding schools and missionaries, but also being the great-great-great-grandchild of Tilly Paul Tamaree, right? And other family members who took up Christianity intentionally. And so where I came to was being able to separate the weaponization of Christianity or Christ's teachings, that power for assimilation and colonization to amass wealth and power. And for many groups, that systemic trauma is then intentionally replaces culture with that religion or that process. But if you go in, and I was raised Baptist and also Presbyterian, and did a lot of reading of biblical texts as part of my education as a child. And so if you actually read the teachings, they're based on love, 100%, right? And addressing oppression. And, it was very rebellious against oppressive regimes. So I've been looking at this for many years, and Sergey has this paper that he wrote when he interviewed elders. And they said that pre-contact, medicine people saw that it was coming, and they actually started to include iconography and concepts, so that way the incongruence wasn't so great that we couldn't communicate or understand. So the intentional, jumping forward, conversion of Tilly Paul Tamaree and other communities around the state, when I talk to elders, is because the traditional taboos, rules, and protocols in some instances were too difficult. So if you were here for the presentation about Tilly Paul Tamaree, you know that she converted because at 13 she was going to be married off to a much older man. And she didn't want to do that, right? So she could step out, and she had a choice. Snook gave her a choice, which one are you going to choose? And so she did that. So then digging even a little bit deeper in our own culture and these belief systems, we have to talk about some of the truths as well. So Chief Sheikh's house, not this one here, but hundreds of years ago when it was originally built, they killed 400 slaves, 100 per each household, or house post. And so that's a truth that we have to reconcile. And I thought, well, okay, that makes sense in the writings why our elders would understand blood sacrifice, right? And this ultimate sacrifice that then pays atonement and breaks those contracts. So in deep conversations with philosophy and theology and people who study this on a regular basis, basically that process, you don't even have to be Christian for those blood contracts to be canceled, right? That was just a kind of a global effect in that philosophy. So I'm not saying be one way or another, but like this is something that I know that a lot of us, especially in my generation, struggle with quite a bit in trying to understand where to center ourselves. So just sharing that thought process. So back to the more applied trauma, we have the historical trauma, intergenerational trauma, and persisting trauma that we experience. We've heard a lot about that, so I'm not going to go deeply into it. But trauma is stress. It's a stress that we cannot mitigate and we cannot address or cope with. And there's, prolonged exposure to stress causes physical, mental, spiritual aspects of a person to be affected. And it can either be a major stressor, like with high intensity at one point, or it can be a long-term stressor that we experience over a period of time. And so they affect us in the way that we are, and they can even affect our epigenetics. So these things, trauma, can get coded into our epigenetics. And there's Dr. Ann Bullock used to be with the IHS, and she did actually a lot of research into this. And so you'll find that generations after, like the generation that experienced the trauma, their offspring, whether it's their children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren, have higher prevalences of allergies and immune issues, have higher prevalences of cognitive issues or chronic health issues that occur. And so I hear people say all the time, we never had this many allergies, right? Well, now we have some insight into what is that. It's that heightened immune response system, because our physiological, our spiritual, and our emotional are not separate from each other. So if you're in heightened state of stress and reactivity, then your immune system is going to respond in kind and be in heightened states. And then you'll pass that coding to the next generation. The interesting thing is we can actually change our epigenetics. We can heal them. And it's not as fast as some of these, experiences that cause them, but it can be done. One of the things that we have to really address is on the next level then, after we're born, is the adverse childhood experiences. Does everybody pretty much know what those are by now? Yeah? Okay. So those also have long-term lasting effects. And if you have a score of 4 or more, they can link, there's correlative increase in cancer or mental health issues or addiction, right, that are experienced. And it's not a sentence, like you don't have to have those things, but they do occur. And it's interesting because one of the most important protective factors to ACEs and the experience of trauma, besides not having it in the first place, right? But one of the most important factors is having a strong caregiver bond, at least one, long-term strong caregiver bond. And that is one of the most protective factors. And what I think about our system of aunties and uncles and how important and how protective that medicine is of being an auntie and an uncle. Okay. So to kind of crosswalk over into, in our way of thinking, it's holistic. And some of this other Western stuff, like they have tracks of information. I've had to pull from different tracks and kind of like weave it together. So in this understanding, climate grief and solastalgia, they're psychological traumas. We will experience physical effects as well, but largely we're going to experience a lot of emotional, and spiritual grief associated with this. And trauma can destroy social systems and different, our self-esteem, our understanding, our desire to thrive is all affected by this. And the recovery process requires reconstruction of these systems. And so that's where we're at now, right? If we look at our historical traumas that we've experienced, the social systems of care, and protection and meaning that support human life, those are all ingrained in our culture. And so as we're working together, revitalizing our culture, these systems are being rebuilt. And it's kind of interesting because these scientists went up and they researched climate grief and solastalgia up north, and they came away, and their takeaway was that action feels better than anxiety. And I kind of laughed and was like, yes, it does. But if you're just doing action for catharsis, you're going to burn out like pretty fast, right? And so then it made me think about our processes of action. What are our processes of action? And they're coming together in stewarding the land and taking care of each other. So we have to switch this cycle, which is, we're already working on it, we're already doing it. Why I wasn't here earlier to go up the river was we had a transboundary dialogue on Indigenous stewardship of the Stikine and the watersheds, right? So this is the process, we're on the right path. And our lens, for healing and recovery is that our culture, it keeps our children safe, keeps us safe, and helps us to heal. And even in the research in the ACEs studies, community, culture, and spirituality, they're one of the core protective systems that we can have to heal ourselves and to also safeguard ourselves from future issues. So when we're looking at climate change, we actually need to look at it as a public health issue because the Earth will continue on without us. Right? So we're the ones that have to change and to right our past wrongs to be able to stay. So the primary prevention is adaptation and mitigation. And according to our traditions, we know that the climate does change. We also know, because we love science, and I think Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian people are brilliant, and so we also know that science is showing that it's happening a lot faster than it used to happen. And so adaptation, right, this is an indigenous thing. We've done this before. And we can actually use our traditional stories to help understand this process. So our traditional stories we used to be more inland. And then when the glaciers started to recede and the ice shelves started to melt, the climate in that space started to collapse. There was less food, there was sickness and starvation, more injuries because things were destabilized. And in that process, we had to make a choice and we had to move. Now, it was very traumatic. So what's the difference between a historical trauma and a story of strength? It's the sovereignty piece. It's the choosing piece. It's the deciding how to move forward and then being able to take those actions necessary to move forward. And so we did that. And that's why that traditional story is one of our stories of strength that connect us throughout our culture. So this transformation, it's like a rites of passage, right? Because before we came out to the coast, we had a predominant Athabascan-based language, and then when we came to the coast, our language shifted and transformed into Tlingit, and we transformed into Tlingit people. And I believe that we can understand this next process that we're going through as a transformation, as a rite of passage. And it's not just for us, it's actually going to be a rite of passage for the Western system, where they're going to have to shed a lot of belief systems and a lot of, negative things that do not serve. And so this evolution will require internal and external journeys. So a lot of us will need to move from the coast up higher, and we'll have to go through the internal journey of letting go of what no longer serves us as we move forward and allow ourselves to heal so that it's easier. Because what happens is if we have past traumas that we don't address, it actually causes a failure to transition, and that's a real diagnostic in behavioral health, a failure to transition, and it's the inability to uptake new information or to let go of old routines. And so this is part of that shift in that process. So, our worldview and culture, I'm not going to read all this to you, but basically culture has two parts to it. There's an intentional aspect that we develop through what we choose to hand down, and then there's an unintentional aspect that we define by environment, events, and influences from other cultures. And then we get to choose, when we're in a space of sovereignty, what we hand down to our children. So we're evolving as a species, and we can direct this evolution because we have the capacity. And not only can we survive, but we can even thrive. We have stories of Alaska being warm at one point of time, and people were here. We've been here when Alaska was warm. We've been here when Alaska was cold. We've been here tens of thousands of years. And so as we transition into this warmer climate, because what I've also learned from elders is that we're not going to reverse it. We're not going backwards. We can slow it down, we can stop it, and we can probably dial it back a little bit, but we're not going back to the way it was. And the same behaviors that got us into this problem will not be sufficient to get us out of this problem. So we have to bring in our traditional values, and our elders, that's also another traditional story or prophecy, that people will come to the indigenous people of the North to learn how to live. And we'll need to teach them about plant medicine and about values and about stewardship and culture. And so that's where we're at right now. And that's one of the, we're not only building this for us, but our culture was sustainable through different climates, through eons. And so once we apply this on our own terms, right, in teaching the Western system, then we'll evolve as a species together. Because Tlingits and Haida and Tsimshian, we love adopting people, right? We have our families, and we're not sending anybody home. Well, maybe that one, but I won't talk about that. Jokes. So stages of recovery, right? Safety and stabilization, learning how to regulate, remembrance and mourning. And tomorrow, when we go through the ceremonies with Jim LaBelle and Bob Sam, that's part of that process. And our elders taught us the ku'ich. My throat's really dry, so please forgive me for not pronouncing correctly. But we have that template of how to do this correctly. And then recognition and integration and creation of a new sense of self and future. And so as Indigenous people, we are adaptable. That gives us permission to upgrade ourselves and uptake new information and to decide who we are. Part of this process, though, is it's great unless your basic needs aren't met. So a traditional chief, their duties were to ensure that the basic needs of a community are met. Because we're only as strong as our weakest person. We're only as fast as our slowest person. And we, on our own protocols, will be judged against the suffering of our most vulnerable. So food, water, medicine, clothing, and shelter for our people, all people, is required before we can go into this next level. Because if we tell people all of this higher level stuff and they don't have a safe place to be and they don't have enough food to eat, then it's actually counterproductive. It's harming people even further. And I just want to give a shout out to Esther, because talking about the Smokehouse Project and the Gardens Project and ensuring that food security here in the community, and tribes all over Southeast are working on food security and meeting these base needs. So I think that we're actually in a really good place. So what is traditional healing? It refers to health practice and approaches, knowledge and beliefs, incorporating First Nations healing and wellness while using ceremonies, plant, animal, or mineral-based medicines, also energetic therapies, or physical and hands-on techniques. Traditional healing is a Western word. It's a Western term. It's like saying doctor. Are you a doctor of psychology? Are you a doctor of podiatry? Are you a veterinarian doctor? Like, what kind of doctor are you? And there's lots of gifts. And so different traditional healers will have different gift sets that they can contribute to a community. And the funny thing is a lot of the stuff now that's practiced as traditional healing is parts of it used to be household knowledge, right? Even just the plants that we pick and eat. And everybody had somebody in the family who provided energy work or body work or, doctored each other when we didn't feel well. And so it's not technically a position that is traditional healing in itself, and that body of work isn't separate from the community. It's very integrated into the community. But we do have bodies of work that are at a different classification, right? Like our icht work, our medicine work. And a lot of times they had their own houses or they lived away from the community. And so this is just talking about the traditional healing, right? So whatever couldn't be handled at home, you went to the specialist to go and get work done. So I love this term, Oscar Quagley. Just so you know, Oscar Quagley was married to Meda DeWitt from Wrangell, and she helped edit his work and typed it for him. So just, if some of the stuff sounds kind of clinket, that's why. Because they talked and built together. And he was brilliant. I don't want to diminish him, but I'm just saying there's the influence of a strong Kachari woman from Wrangell. So a community's medicine person is a messenger between the nature, human beings, and supernatural, communicated easily and readily between them, blending pragmatic and inductive and spiritual realms. The medicine person had an added dimension of access to the spiritual world to solve conundrums or puzzles presented by nature. Their function was to explore and interpret what they saw creatively and positively with the insight to be taught to the people. So, traditional resiliency strategies, right? We're talking about base level. And I always want to make sure that we, say there's that special place for the icht, but there's some people who still have fear. So I want to make sure that it's like, this is not exactly what I'm addressing. It's the traditional resiliency strategies that traditional healers help to share with the community. And so a lot of these things, we saw in earlier slides, but also with helping with spirituality, with community, those base needs. We have healers in our community, and they do it through song leaders, strong song leaders to lead us, or through hunting and fishing and gathering. Our games and competitions help to build relationships, getting out some of our angst. Maybe we need to do more competitions, eh? And I kind of want to do a comparison with you. And some people say that we don't need Western medicine to substantiate our traditional healing. And I like to look at it differently, like it just builds the body of knowledge. I don't think that Western medicine's better. And traditional healing is wonderful, but there's things that we're dealing with that we didn't have to deal with before. We didn't have to deal with opioid or heroin addiction before. We didn't have to deal with COVID pandemics before. Like there's lots of things that we didn't have to deal with. So, and we got stunted in our body of knowledge with colonization. So in adaptation, I feel like we can just use that Western knowledge to just fill in there and just use what's right and correct to build. So the vagus nerve is actually needed to transition into a state of healing. So if people are experiencing anxiety or having panic or in states of trauma or post-traumatic stress disorder, they're not going to be sinking into healing levels, whether it's the brain waves or the blood flow or the nerve relays, all of that. And people can get stuck in those states and not be able to sink down. And part of it has to do with the tone of the vagus nerve or the strength of the vagus nerve. And so the vagus nerve is a key part of our parasympathetic rest and digest nervous system. And the internal biological process that represents the activity of the vagus system is part of, when we eat something warm and you can feel yourself relax, that's one way to understand it as well. Increasing our vagal tone activates the parasympathetic nervous system, and having higher vagal tone means your body can relax faster after stress, so we can recover faster. So ways to stimulate the vagus nerve to relax and de-stress, right? Cold exposure, deep and slow breathing, singing, humming, chanting, and gargling, probiotics, meditation, omega-3 fatty acids, exercise, massage, and socializing and laughing. Did they just write down all of our traditional healing core strategies? Right? Cold exposure, dipping, or jumping into the bay to get ready for winter. Deep and breathe, slow breathing, controlled breathing exercises. I know that Tina Woods has been leading us in that. We also had that as part of our meditation practices or our being present and aware practices pre-contact. Singing, humming, chanting, and gargling. Well, of course, we do that as much as we possibly can. And I think of gargling as, not as gargling, but our language is so glottal, right? So our language in itself helps to tone the vagus nerve. And then probiotics, we have our fermented foods. Meditation, we have our seclusion and fasting practices. Omega-3 fatty acids, we have our salmon. Exercise, well, we used to walk everywhere or canoe, so, right? And massage, things that we used to do on a household level. And socializing and laughing, right? So we checked all those boxes. And so if we're just engaging in these alone, then we're going to help ourselves start to heal from trauma. And it's kind of interesting because some of the simplest things are some of the most profound things, right? The number one protective measure against ACEs is a caregiver, like we said earlier. So our aunties and uncles, our grandmas and grandpas, our moms and dads. And nowadays, I don't want to, diminish moms and dads, but it used to be at a certain age, right? Your aunties and uncles took you and trained you. I like to go even further and say the World Health Organization, right? What's a state of good mental health? It's an individual realizes his or her own abilities, can cope with normal stresses in life, and can work productively and is able to make contribution to his or her community. So in the positive sense, mental health is a foundation for an individual well-being and effective functioning community. So realizing his or her own ability. So when we're taught skills and we go out and do skills such as hunting or fishing or gathering, right, we're realizing our ability. Can cope with normal stresses in life. We talked about things that help us cope that are ingrained in our culture. And can work productively and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. That's our traditional food gathering processes, right there. So our culture is the definition of good mental health. And then there's the added, sharing is a core aspect. It creates social connectivity, helps to be in service to each other, and requires a healthy, thriving ecosystem. And as Indigenous people, when we're raised in an environment with stories and lineages of relationship, the environment becomes an extension of ourself, our community, our culture, and worldview. The environment becomes a primary teacher, a living being, and a connector to spirituality that creates a sense of place or purpose. So I would say that relationship with Mother Earth and the environment is an ACE protective factor, right? So we're going to go into some plants, right? This is Tsats. It's Hedysarum alpinium. It is a traditional plant. And we know that our names, our place names, they hold meaning. And I like to use this plant to just share that kind of connectivity. So, Trothyetta, right? UAF is on Trothyetta. So Troth in UAF, not UAS, but Trothyetta in Atna is Potato Hill, and it's the Hedysarum alpinium. And so there were so many of those plants there that multiple groups would come and gather them in the spring and the fall. And they would share information at that point and then go back out on their routes. And so when they were going to build UAF, they asked the elders, Howard Luke and other elders, if it was an appropriate place to build the university. And when they sat and talked, they decided that yes, it was, because that used to be the exchange of knowledge between clan groups in the spring and the fall. So it'd be a perfect place to put a university. And this plant is actually found all the way up north, all the way down to California. And it's one of our primary complex carbohydrates. And if you've ever smelled it, it's kind of halfway between potato and oatmeal. It's like a sweet potato smell. But the thing is, with all of our plants, there's rules that we have in cooking them. So this is a plant that you want to cook with, like deer tallow or seal grease. It needs to be cooked with oil. But we were talking about protective factors. I got to sit with Franca Dachloedi elder in Carcross, and he was talking about his experience at boarding school or residential school at the time. And he said that when they were walking to school, the boys, because they had pockets or more pockets, they would pull these plants and they would stuff their pockets with them because they weren't getting enough food at the residential schools. They're malnourished. And so they would chew on them throughout the day, and they would share them with other kids, and they would just put pieces of it and suck on it and chew on it throughout the day to provide carbohydrates and minerals, and so that they weren't suffering from hunger pains through the day. This is our plant, our mother, taking care of us, always present. So some of you may know Dr. Grandma Rita Blumenstein. She's one of my primary mentors, and she would talk about how the plants are going to move north. So be prepared to bring the best ones. And what she was talking about is with climate change, we're getting warmer. And what we're supposed to do is actually talk to our neighbors to the south and find out what are their cornerstone plants for medicine and food, and start moving them up to the next region. And it used to be that medicine people would trade. We all know that the Tlingit potato was through trade. It didn't go to Europe, and it wasn't brought by the Spanish or the Russians or the Americans. It was through indigenous trade that we got the Tlingit and Haida potato, right? Kuntz. We also used to grow tobacco pre-contact and at contact, but it's not endemic to Alaska. It's something that had to be planted, and lower in the further south, they planted outside, and when the colder up that you went into the north, they would grow it in the eaves of the house for trade and for use. So trading is a part of who we are and adapting. So spirituality is a combination of cultural beliefs, right? They're a developed worldview guide, the foundations of spirituality. There's so many different parts of spirituality. I'm not going to go through a whole compendium list because we could do like 5 PhDs, one for each region on the topic. But when you come down to the base of our traditional spirituality, all things have spirit, right? All spirit deserves respect. All things are connected through the spiritual world or realm, and all creation is equally valued and has a purpose, whether we can use it or not, right? Because some purposes are, even if we don't benefit from them, they're still valuable and have a purpose. And spirituality and religion aren't the same thing, and so our traditional spirituality and religions can exist in the same space, whatever religion that a person chooses. So I have a whole bunch more slides, but I'm not going to go through those. I'm going to go through some pictures, because I know some of you wanted to be here for the plants. So today we went up the Sticking River, and it was so beautiful to go up that river. I love Southeast, and I love Alaska, but going up the river, I was like, oh my gosh, this is the most beautiful place on earth. Absolutely. And as a plant person, looking at the different features in the land, because if you look at this, a lot of people just see eroding banks. What do I see? I see easy to harvest spruce roots. I also see in other places Devil's Club, and their roots are hanging out, and they're going to fall off into the river. So harvesting that Devil's Club that's on the most outer edges, that's an ethical harvest. You don't have to feel bad about harvesting the whole plant. And, you would make your offering, and you would sing, and then you'd be able to harvest. And those Hedysarum alpinium, they love to grow in this loamy soil. How many of you have dug Indian potatoes? 2 people. Sweet. 3 people. So their tubers they're like generally this big. They can get to this big, and they can be like this long, or they can be like chain linked tubers, right? So they have sections of tubers, and they can go feet out and down. And like you can start digging, and then like dig all these little holes and trenches all around this plant, finding all these little potatoes. And it can take hours. And then I've done it with people. And we spent a whole afternoon to get that one bowl that I showed in that picture earlier. And when we brought that in, it was at Howard Luke's camp. Luke Titus walked in and he goes, "Now there's some Indian food. I haven't seen that since I was a kid." Part of what happened is, of course, with assimilation and uptake of the Western foods, a lot of our traditional foods went by the wayside. But also there was a huge taboo on the plant Hedysarum McKinseyi, which in that Into the Wild with McCandles or whatever, they actually rewrote the description of the plant and lied about the plant and defamed it, right, in pop culture. So people were then afraid to harvest this plant. But you don't eat the pods, you eat the roots. And the roots of the Hedysarum McKinseyi, they're tough and they're skinny. And so you wouldn't want to eat them anyways, right? And they wouldn't hurt you. So this learning about our traditional plants is not only a decolonization, but an indigenization. We're realigning ourselves and reconnecting to Earth and who we are. I'd really love to see, every household knowing how to pick our regular everyday foods or medicines that we would have used. Yeah, it was about everything I had not to jump off the boat and go dig in the sand, but I had to be back by 4. And Jacqueline's my auntie, and I would have been in a lot of trouble. So, of course, in the spring, we have lots of greens. Fiddleheads are available in the springtime, and you want to harvest them when they're super curled up and tight. And it's interesting because this was on a trail that was opened up. And so this concept of nature being wild and untouched wasn't a reality. It's actually a fallacy, because we touched every part of everything, and we opened up areas. In the winter, we would burn berry patches and burn down the willows and the small trees so we could get enough light in to have a berry patch and to grow fatter berries, because they need that sunlight. In the winter, we had a talk on the way up about the trees that have the beetles or the moths that are killing the trees. And it's like, but in the winter, if you had sick trees, you'd burn them in the winter when it was so wet that nothing else would catch. But we're not doing those kinds of things anymore. So when we open up these spaces, we create fern beds, we create berry beds, we create greens availability. And so our ferns are one of the first greens that are available in the spring, and they're high in iron and fiber, and they help to flush the system out. Because in the winter, we're eating a lot of dried meats or things preserved in fats. And so your intestines, they get kind of lazy. It's like with the American diet, they get laxed and they start to get holes in them and you get leaky gut, something or other. But with our traditional foods, we have systematic seasonal eating. And it's when you start looking at the timing of things, like the salmon berry. The salmon berry is one of the first berries that are available. It does not have high antioxidants. It does have high manganese. And you need high manganese to uptake antioxidants. So it is a primer berry so that you can get all the benefits from the other berries. Sorry, I'm getting all excited. I'm talking about salmon berry before I even get there. And this is a little one that I found that I was looking for. And actually, don't laugh at me, but I don't know the name of this one. I had just seen it once, and somebody had said that their elder called it a mighty, like it was a mighty healer, and you'd want to add it to medicines. But the leaves on it are like tiny. They're oosky. They're just itty bitty. And so you don't find it all over the place. And there's some other things that kind of look like it. But it was, in this open area, because it had plenty of space, it was actually growing in abundance. And then we have plantain. Now, plantain is actually an introduced plant. We don't call it invasive because it's not overtaking everything and destroying the forest. So it's an introduced plant. But it's a good adopted clan member because it is super medicinal, and you can actually make it into salves, and it'll be a bug repellent, or it will help to fight inflammation, and it will also help fight infection, and it draws things out of the system, right? So it draws negative things or toxic things out of the system. You can also eat these. If you pick the leaf and you tear it, there's going to be little threads in it, like celery. You pull those out, and then you eat it, because those little threads are actually kind of bitter. And so if you have the time, you can actually make like kale chips out of these if you want to. And then the stalk, the big stalk, the seed stalk that comes on the plantains, that's actually psyllium husk. And so that's what's used in Metamucil and other products to help to create movement or bowel motility. It makes you go poop. So this is just, one trail walking up to a small cabin. And, in this space, we have so many different types. We've got salmon berries. There were black currants. We have devil's club. There's alder. There's, willow. There's cottonwood. There's spruce. Just, a magnificent, collection of plants that are used for food and medicine. And people don't realize that the pharmaceutical industry, I learned this from Chris Cavalin, who did his PhD, and he in law and traditional healing, and 70% approximately of Western pharmaceuticals are made from indigenous medicines. And there's almost zero reciprocity. In the last couple of decades, biopiracy has been addressed, and there's been more community-based research to find new things. But if you imagine this multi-billion-dollar economy, and 70% is traditional molecules from traditional medicine. One of the things I think about actually in the context is valerian root. And you know how we are always told that devil's club, like some people think the devil's club was the only plant that we used because we love it so much. I'm not going to say that we don't, but we did use other plants. And it was interesting because I was doing some research in one of the old Emmons or somebody who came up, and they were talking about how bad we smelled. He couldn't handle it. He was saying, but it was because we used so much valerian root. Who here has smelled valerian root? It can be very strong. And I kind of laughed because it made so much sense. Valerian helps to reduce anxiety. It helps to relieve the muscles. It helps to reduce insomnia. It brings on good dreams. And so we smelled because we would just slather ourselves in, medicine made from valerian. And I was like, well, of course we're going to have a balancer for SOK or devil's club. Of course we are. Because it's a ginseng, it's a stimulant. It gets you riled and going and wakes you up and moves, our blood and our lymph and all of our interstitial fluids, and it helps to bring in visions and cleanse us, right? It's very action-oriented. And so the reciprocal, right, raven or eagle to our devil's club is valerian. That's I almost think of them as like marriage partners, or because they balance each other. And so valerian, you can use the flowers as dream pillows. And I've helped people, who hadn't dreamt in years. And so you have them do time smelling valerian, and it helps to bring back the dreams. There's, in the old European apothecary books, they talk about using the leaves in a tea. So if you have a married couple or a couple who are arguing, they would make tea out of the leaves, and they'd have to sip this tea while they sat down to talk and work out their issues to help them from arguing. And the roots are really potent and strong medicine. So one of the things about Western pharmaceuticals is Valium gets its molecules from valerian. But Valium, it's a muscle relaxer, but it is addictive. And it can cause anger and aggression. So those molecules live in harmony in that plant with other bioavailable molecules to help balance that out. That then addresses aggression. It's just wild how we have these things in our own medicine that help to balance. Here, this doesn't have berries on it right now, but here is a red elderberry. And I used to not teach about it. I guess now that I'm in my 40s and I have enough gray hairs, I feel more comfortable teaching about certain things. But elderberry, we buy in the store black elderberry for immune system and to help, expectorate phlegm. Our red elderberry does the same thing. And it's everywhere. We've got tons and tons of it. We've got enough red elderberry that we could probably mass market it and still not cause an issue. The challenge with it, though, is there are molecules that cause cyanide to build up in your system. So you can't just go eat it. You have to apply heat treatment. You have to cook it and strain out the seeds. And when you do that, then you're left with the medicine. It's funny because I did a big batch this fall, gallons, and the kids come in, they're like, "Are you cooking tomatoes?" I was like, "No." Actually, not all the kids. It was kind of funny because my fiance's family is Italian. So it was the Italian kids, descendants that were like, "Are you cooking tomatoes?" I'm like, "No, they don't smell like tomatoes." And my kids are like, "They don't smell like tomatoes." And all of them are like, "It smells like tomatoes." So I don't know how that works, but it was pretty funny. And they even think it tastes like tomatoes. But I made a cough syrup, so that way we can have this cough syrup and added, honey and spices, so that it's going to be shelf stable. And so all you have to do is cook it. So every single plant that we have protocols for engagement. They all have rules for engagement. And traditionally, they would all have their stories that would teach us these rules. And that's one of the differences between botany, ethnobotany, and then one of my friends who's also a multi-generational plant person, who's actually Dr. Rita's niece and Karen Brooks's daughter. Her name is Jennifer Andruli, and she said we should just use the word ethno-herbalism because the herbalism tradition incorporates story and lore, right? This other part. And she said we should just, own that and coin that term. So ethno-herbalism is just a fancy way of saying, right, indigenous traditional stories or relationships with these plants. And some of our relationships go back tens of thousands of years, and not every single family or clan is going to have the same story or the same song or exactly the same protocols. And so you can have two groups of people in the same room who have different rules and different ways of making the medicine that are contradictory, and they can still both be right. And that's the same way with our clan rules, right? And we have to honor that. But everybody has to cook this one. We also had plenty of alder bushes out there, and alder is used for several different things. One of them, of course, is dye, and then our tall alder is some of our carvers' favorites because it's so hard. And it's used as a switch in steam bath. And by the way, all clink gets steamed pre-contact. Everybody did steam bath. And so those molecules actually, what I've found that this is the best for is if you take one of these leaves and it's sticky on the bottom, you can actually put it on mosquito bites and no-see-um bites and white sox bites or fly bites, and it will take out the itch and the sting and the poison. And so I love this plant for that reason, because when I get no-see-um bites, they don't go away for a really long time. And so when I put one of these leaves on, they're gone in, less than an hour. And so it reduces that inflammation, draws out poison. It also helps to just balance the system. So that's why we steamed with it and used it that way. Our weavers will also use it. Some of our alders that have the red bark, they'll use it for dye as well. And there's an alder. So this is a oh, how am I spacing that name? So funny. So arnica. Um, this arnica plant is something that's used topically. You don't take it internally because it's a little bit toxic internally. So it's a topical application. And there's another plant that looks just like it. So you want the ones with the leaves that are bilateral. They want to be symmetrical. And that one's the arnica. And it helps relieve bruises and muscle pain, right? And that tissue damage. It helps to alleviate and heal tissue damage. So I didn't pick the plant. I did get some seeds though. So I'll be growing this one in the garden. And we had a good conversation about fireweed. This one's River Beauty. It has the same principles as our fireweed. It's just dwarf or shorter. And is Trixie in here? No. So Trixie and I had a really good conversation. An undisclosed participant had a tummy ache from breakfast, and so she had fireweed tincture with her, and so she gave it to them. And fireweed balances the whole body. And they have River Beauty even in Tibet, and Tibetan medicine uses it very similar to the way that we use fireweed. So Shlush is a resilient plant, and it's a full body balancer. It doesn't have any contraindications. That means it doesn't go against any medicines. You can have it with all the things that you take. But the flowers have bioflavonoids in them that help to build the eyes. And they also, if you dry these and you drink the tea in winter, it helps to alleviate anxiety that we experience, especially with seasonal affective disorder. Now, it's not going to cure you. My disclaimer here, none of this is meant to replace any of your medications. Please talk to your doctor if you have any questions. Okay, done. So, these flowers, we have a lot of people who make the jellies out of them. Now, sugar is a little counterproductive, but you can, that's it's that uptake of those bioflavonoids. And the leaves have mucilage in them and inulin. So it's a balancer for the gut, whether you have diarrhea or constipation or gas, any of those things, you can have the tea or eat the young leaves for those issues. And then the root, again, is one of our complex carbohydrates. And if you ever pull up the root, there's medicine in it. And if you tincture it, you put them in and they're creamy colored, the tincture will turn fireweed pink. And it's kind of a fun science experiment. So, but when you harvest the roots, there's going to be a cord in the middle, like a raffia. It's kind of a hard, papery cord. So you just peel the flesh off of that. You can eat it raw, you can cook it, you can, add it to different dishes as you see fit. And the molecules that are anti-inflammatory, so this actually helps to address leaky gut issues and inflamed intestinal issues. Because it has molecules that reduces inflammation, it helps to promote tissue growth, it's going to help to create motility or to slow things down, it's going to reduce gas, it's a prebiotic, which means the good bacteria that need inulin food to live in the guts, it provides that. So it creates a good host environment for good bacteria. And so you can eat it as a fresh spring green. You can drink it, you don't want to eat it when they get tough or fibrous because it will it's just too much. It's too much fiber for people. It's not very good. So you would then make the tea out of the older leaves. And then the younger ones you can still eat all the way up until they turn into seeds, right? And you can dry it and drink the leaves throughout the winter. Now the inside of the fireweed stalk, if you split it open, the pith has a subtle sweetness to it, and we would use that to sweeten things. And so you can also, when it's older and bigger and larger in stock, you'll have enough in there that you can harvest to add to soap berries. Because this here is Angelica, and it is a woman's herb, and some people picked it in the spring as a green. We like our spring greens or beach greens. There's lovage, which looks like this. There's Angelica. There's a few others as well. They're all in the same umbra family. And so this one is definitely Angelica. Some people are afraid that there's water hemlock that are interbreeding with them, but water hemlock has a very specific look to it and sharpness to it. So I'd suggest before harvesting this, you go with somebody who knows the difference between them and can teach you. So this plant is related to another plant that's used in Chinese medicine, danquai, that's used for women's health. And it was kind of interesting because I didn't harvest this one until I got older. There's some plants that you're not supposed to really work with until you're past childbearing age. So this one, when harvesting it, it looked like the female, like a pregnant female, because the root was bulbous and had two offshoot legs. Am I in trouble with time? Okay. You're all free to go whenever you want. Here's a little bit of a closer look at these leaves, right, for Angelica. And I brought home some seeds, so I will be planting her in the yard. We have just beautiful, daisies and paintbrush and just so many plants in there. We've got different varieties of rose family, which is sweet plume. This one right here is really sweet. And these funny little white plumes, this is sweet plume. If you ever get a chance, smell it. So it's part of the rose family, and you would never guess that it smells good, but it's like perfume. Yep, so here we're talking about all the different layers of plants. So Yeti, Nanyai Yeti, and so she's my true opposite, because Teddy Yeti and Nanyai. So she's also a plant person, and it's really fun to share. So this is used as and interesting, the story about that Ben Paul shared about Tilly Paul, Tamari, and her mom. Her mom, and they suspected that she had. And some of the stories that she could use as well. The story has repeated itself in the family line because my grandma had TB as well when she was little, and her mom had it. The two people who main tenders of them were Tilly Paul and little grandma, Ajit, Susie Jones. And Susie did traditional medicine, and of course Tilly used the Western nursing methods that she was taught in the missionary. And they worked side by side. There was no competition. There was no better than. There was no worse than. And, my grandma lived till she was 94 years old. And there's different plants. I haven't been able to speak to Ajit, obviously, to ask her what she used. But I would say she probably used yarrow as one of them, because it helps purge the system. It's purgative. So you cough out, sweat out infection and toxicity. And there's different ways to apply it to cause that. But that will whack. A lot of plants won't go to, because the waxy fats are there, like the cholesterols, and they add added barrier or protective layers. So the lungs have waxy fats, right? Our brain, our system, waxy fats. so it helps to get into those tissues to help clean them out. The root, is a pain reliever. Of course, it's affecting the nerves. Nerve pain is really hard to treat. There's lots of pain, a lot of pain, but pain is hard to treat. Some of the best is cottonwood bud resin is one of the best for nerve pain. And then, of course, sacht and yarrow. So I would guess that she used yarrow. I would also speculate that she used fresh spring skunk weed or skunk cabbage, because it has, again, even because you have to cook it outside, it has to dry outside, and you have to make it outside. But then once it's processed, it gets into the lung, it gets into our ligaments and tendons. It will get into our joints, our cartilages, and help to heal those spaces and areas that are difficult to heal. This is just a really pretty picture. Gratuitous, beautiful picture. But I have kept you over, and I'm thankful for everything and listening to this discussion. I guess if you have questions, so let us. Sheesh. Sheesh. For our eyes, yeah, so, well, our fish oils are going to be a big one. And then there's some plants that regulate the humors in the body. And so, like the silverweed, that tea is a diuretic and to balance fluids in the body, chamber fluid in our eyes. Also, things with A, like the fireweed that we just saw, that's going to be really important. I know that there's an eye wash that's made of crow or blackberry or crow their leaves. You can strain it out. You have to strain it really well because you don't want any debris in the eyes. So you have to, like very fine straining. And you can do the eye washes with those. And then depending on whether or not it depends on what part of the eye, really. But those are good places to start. Yeah, thank you. I don't have a handout, and I haven't pulled any of my work, so you can I have a plant book, so I probably, but the ones I have are there's Anchorage Museum. I did some women's rights of passage with them, and they have a chatter marks, so that's something that you can Google. So just move it. There's a lot of talked about traditional healing is in ProQuest. So if you do it traditional healing in ProQuest, you can, and they're all free. I usually source the things I make because information shared with me or gifted to me by my grandma or my aunties or mentor or even my uncles and other teachers, all gifted. I don't sell the products of written work, but I do charge for time in other places so that I navigate. This is the doorway to a place through NHG, and that talks about healing and trauma as well. I was one of the authors on that. And I don't know, there's anything, sorry.
oh, you know, I and it really, or it made me feel
Yeah. Are we on Zoom or are we
out
on
of
Zoom?
that way.
Okay.
Like,
I know. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you. Okay. Well, I know it's good to see. And let me done. Hold on. Do we have another question or wait? Yeah. Or so. Yeah. I was when they're available.